I ended up starting my own little company a number of years ago. We ended up getting into homeschool education, which is our company, Compass Classroom. But about 7 or 8 years ago, I guess it would have been 2014, my daughter, who was 10 at the time, she really was starting to ask questions about creation and evolution. And what I realized is that she was asking questions I'd asked when I was, 14, 15. I was teaching a youth group at the same time. So basically said, hey, I wonder if there should be, a documentary that could explore this question of creation and evolution and what the Bible says in Genesis. And so that's what led me to pick up the phone and start to call some of these guys, Steve Austin, Andrew Snelling, a lot of these PhDs that had spent their lives sort of building up an argument, to be quite honest, for a young earth creation view, a global flood. And I thought, well, great, let's try to do a documentary on it. And one thing led to another. And after a couple of years, we had his Genesis history.
Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers, because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button, and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and working on a product to help people overcome these problems, because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up, and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Thomas Purifoy. He's a producer, a writer, and a director. He was involved in the series called Is Genesis History? And now he's working on a new documentary that is going to go in deep about the Grand Canyon and how it was formed, how long it took, etc. So welcome to the call, Thomas. Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate the invitation. It's great to be here.
If you would, tell me a bit about your background first. How did you get involved in these projects? What was your past like?
Well, I got involved with the project. Well, more recently, I got involved with because of my daughter, but I can go a little further back. I went to Vanderbilt and ended up going in the Navy for a number of years. I was an officer on the East Coast in amphibs, special warfare, and then ended up going into education. I worked overseas for a little bit as a missionary, as a teacher. And then also, I guess right before that, I'd been out in LA doing some screenwriting. So meaning a screenwriting school and trying to get involved in that world. So in the Lord's mysterious providence, he ended up putting me in Nashville, where I ended up starting my own little company a number of years ago. We ended up getting into homeschool education, which is our company, Compass Classroom. But about 7 or 8 years ago, I guess it would have been 2014, my daughter, who was 10 at the time, she really was starting to ask questions about creation and evolution. And what I realized is that she was asking questions I'd asked when I was, 14, 15. I was teaching a youth group at the same time. So basically said, hey, I wonder if there should be, a documentary that could explore this question of creation and evolution and what the Bible says in Genesis. And so that's what led me to pick up the phone and start to call some of these guys, Steve Austin, Andrew Snelling, a lot of these PhDs that had spent their lives sort of building up an argument for, to be quite honest, for a young earth creation view, a global flood. And I thought, well, great, let's try to do a documentary on it. And one thing led to another. And after a couple of years, we had his Genesis history.
What was the reception when you guys first came out with this Genesis history? Was it a big acclaim, or did you have a lot of pushback?
It's funny. We didn't have a lot of pushback. I don't think anyone knew who we were. I mean, they probably still don't know who I am. But when it came out, we actually did a short It's called a short release. I think that's what they're called through Fathom Events. This is February 2017. And it ended up being the top film for Fathom that year. I think they had a theatrical piece that did a little better, a Broadway theatrical release. But in terms of an actual a documentary film or feature film, it was the highest grossing piece. And so there were a couple of encores. And then, it was for about many, many years on the top 10 Amazon DVD. And, I know we've had millions and millions of people around the world see it, whether through the theater or through DVD or now through YouTube and all the other places it's available.
All right. What were some of the main questions that people had from the series or comments on it? Like what jumps out at you?
Well, it's funny. I think a lot of people were not aware of all this information. And part of what I wanted to try to do was to give a broad overview of just what these scientists were arguing. It's the Minority Report. It's obviously a very specialized view that argues that, Genesis is a reasonable book of history. And actually, if you start looking at the world around you, there's a lot of evidence that fits into that paradigmatic structure that Genesis is arguing, sort of a model, if you will. And so my goal was to lay out sort of that 30,000-foot overview of all the pieces. But what we found, it was really funny. One of the first things we would hear is it was released on Netflix and was on Netflix for a year. And people would say, yeah, I watched it 10 times. I was like, what? The documentary breaks a lot of rules. It's all PhDs talking. It's lots of complex stuff. It puts one complex piece after the other. And so it's not always easily understandable. What I realized is we got to realize people were like having to watch it 5 and 6 times they would hear something and say, now what is this? And they would come back and watch it again and watch it again. We started to hear tons of people telling us this. And so I think this is probably a little long-winded, and I apologize, I can be long-winded. So just jump in at any time and interrupt me. But I think the end result was that we had a huge number of people say, thank you. We'd never put all these pieces together or heard them before like this. And so, it's been absolutely fascinating. We want to learn more. And so that's why we made lots and lots of other materials, supporting it. But that was really kind of the best thing we got was that it was a lot of positive comments on it.
I think the fact that people watched it multiple times, though, tells you that the information really hit home. It was important to them. And, it's rare when someone doesn't understand something. They usually just give up. The fact that people stayed the course and did that really is a powerful signal, I think.
Well, here's my perspective on this is I feel like that for at least a couple hundred years, there has been sort of a view, the history of the world that is, it's incompatible ultimately with any kind of a biblical view. And this would be, let's be honest, this would be Jewish, this would be Muslim, this would be Christian. So if you're going to take a Judeo-Christian view of the world, for at least, going back to Josephus and further back than that, in terms of records that we have, people have held that Genesis is an accurate book of history. So when you start to look at what the, post-Enlightenment stuff did and what happened really in the 19th century in England, you go look at a book by Chambers, which was 1844, the vestiges of creation, where he's presenting, views of Lamarck and Buffon, which is a old earth, an old progressive development of life, kind of the nebula to man argument that people generally hold. That view has kind of been held in ascendancy for quite a long time, but there are a lot of people who hold that, there was Jesus talked about the flood and Peter talked about the flood and they talk about Adam and Eve, that the two views of history are essentially incompatible. And there, a lot of people have tried to make them work together. But to quote Lyell, who was an early geologist, he was like, look, we're trying to get Moses out of the rocks. Darwin, he had his arguments with Asa Gray, who I think was an American. And Gray's like, look, can't we make this work with Christianity? And Darwin's like, yeah, no, I don't think so. And you read their letters. And so I think that what has happened in the 20th century, in the late 20th century, is that people began to say, well, maybe there's a scientific reason for this, that actually this is a reasonable view, and that there are a lot of areas of neo-Darwinian evolutionary thinking that just doesn't really explain the complexity of the genetic record, of the genome. It doesn't really explain the way all these things in our life and geology work. And so,
one thing I remember listening to Stephen Meyer and I don't think he's the only one that said it, but there's no intermediate forms in the fossil record. There's no half an eye, 3/4 of a liver, 2/3 of a bone type thing. So that seems to lend a lot of credence to the fact that it wasn't slow it was quick.
The fossil record's a very strange thing when you get to look at it. But yeah, I mean, the idea when you start to see is, this whole idea of essentially there's equilibrium, there's stasis, and then all of a sudden there's sudden change. And, there was, quote, Kurt Wise, who worked with Stephen Jay Gould, that he was his advisor. And Gould, of course, was punctuated equilibrium was his view of, the evolution, because he knew this. He knew what the fossil record was. And he said, look, there's this equilibrium is what we see in it. And then all of a sudden it's punctuated by these sudden evolutionary changes. And Kurt was like, yeah, but that actually fits better in a creation model. Like that it actually fits better that there's some flood model, because the idea that this was not captured anywhere is really, really weird. And I think it's those weird things that that doesn't really totally make sense. It's the anomaly structures, or the anomaly sequences that continue to build that makes one say, maybe Genesis has a reasonable look at the world. It's just there are consequences if you hold that view.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that too. I've seen a lot of people, and unfortunately I've been one of them in the past, making fun of religion. Those people are just brainwashed idiots, that kind of stuff. How do you deal with that? And did you get a lot of that with this production?
We did not get a lot of that. So part of my annoyance, so you make documentaries for different reasons. I made one for my daughter, and I made one, really, there's 3 reasons. I would say I made it for my daughter. Everyone will do something for their child they probably wouldn't do for anyone else, basically to kind of answer her questions in a way. But I also was really frustrated, and I would read all these criticisms, these scientists, and they would say, oh, they're loons, and they're crazy, and they're dumb. And I was like, so you can say a lot of things about these guys. You may not agree with them, but it's wrong to say they're stupid. Like, I would never, ever say that someone that holds to an evolutionary view of the world is stupid. These are brilliant men and women who just have a different view. They're interpreting the evidence, and I may not think they're right, but you don't say they're dumb, because that would be just wrong. Well, these creationists were totally, excoriated by everyone. And so I really wanted to have a documentary where I was like, okay, just listen to these guys. And after you listen to them for, an hour and 40 minutes, I don't think you're going to think they're dumb. And so that was a big deal. We did not get anyone criticizing us for being dumb. They said we weren't right, but they didn't say we were dumb. And then, of course, the third reason was this view of theistic evolution. BioLogos is a group that had been pushing, theistic evolution among evangelicals. And I saw more and more scholarly evangelicals, pastors, kind of buying into this. And I was like, this is a crazy idea. Like, this idea was...
What idea is it? What's the...
It's theistic evolution. And so the idea, I think they call it now sometimes evolutionary creation. But what happened is there is a group, Francis Collins, he's the one that started this. And so BioLogos, they're a group that's out of, where are they, Grand Rapids. And so they have pushed for years, pouring money. They get money from the Templeton Foundation, funded by millions and millions of dollars, to basically advance an evolutionary view of the world among evangelicals. That's what they're funded to do. And you've got a lot of, Christian smart folks that have kind of jumped on board. But I was like, this is like getting on a train that is everyone else is getting off of it scientifically, and now all these evangelicals are jumping on board. And so I felt there needed to be a presentation to evangelicals and other Christians, not just evangelicals. I mean, it's Roman Catholics. There's, Orthodox Jews, anyone else who holds that the Bible is an authority. I felt they needed to see the other side to realize, there's a view of the world where there's a real Adam and Eve. Like, that's biologos has got real problems. If you have evolutionary theory, you have a major problem having a single Adam and Eve.
Without spoiling the movie, what is an example of one of the natural things that was discovered in the movie that, everyone thinks would take millions of years, but could have happened incredibly quickly?
Well, I mean, let's just take the carving of the Grand Canyon. So that's a super interesting one, because that would be a view that, the many people will hold, well, you've got this tiny river that basically carved this canyon over millions and millions of years. And one of the observations that Dr. Steve Austin, geologist, early on, his idea is that, hey, I think that, something like could carve out this canyon, and then Mount St. Helens erupted. Someone said he was one of the luckiest geologists that Mount St. Helens erupted same year his PhD thesis came out, which was on the floating log mat formation of coal. And so he began to study Mount St. Helens. And of course, peat was created very, very quickly at the bottom of the lake there. Within 5 or 6 years, peat was already there. And usually people say, coal beds create millions of years. And Steve was able to demonstrate, well, this is in less than a decade. We've already got the forebears of coal. Many things, the idea of a stratified forest, he demonstrated there, which they actually changed the signs in the petrified forest, because he was able to demonstrate that actually this is probably much more likely a catastrophic event. The formation and the carving of all of those canyons there in a day from a mud flow. What the geologist recognized was catastrophism, a view that most of the formations in the earth that many people have argued take millions of years actually can happen very, very quickly. And so that's just a quick snapshot of all the different, of a handful of different things. And there's just limitless of these things that can be looked at in a different way.
I wonder if the friends and family of these scientists said they were catastrophizing. The bad joke. That was surprising to me, is that these processes that, again, should take millions of years are possible within just a few years. So you think, what really happened?
It's a different way of looking at the world, but that's what I think a lot of this does, is that one of the things that was important to me is having synthetic views that are comprehensive. And I feel that a lot of people don't realize they have to kind of piecemeal views. So, for instance, what I mean by this is that there is a history where the events have to work together in terms of duration and cause and effect of events. Like, for example, if someone said, World War II took 100 years, everybody would be like, what do you mean? Well, if you say it took 100 years, that means you got to have events that fit into that. And it actually is a structure that means that it's not just a 5-year event or 6 starting from 39. It means it actually takes time. Or if you say it happened in 6 days, well, then that changes the time event and the time horizon. All the events in what I would consider the conventional view, a very old, 4.56 billion year old Earth and a 13 plus billion year old universe, there are events that have to cohere to that time horizon. And the same goes for if you're saying that it's less than 10,000 years. And the question is, you begin to look at things as a history has to all fit together. So then you got to lay in biology, you got to lay into fossil record, you got to lay in geology. And most people, these are overwhelmingly too much information to put together. So they can kind of only look at kind of one thing at a time. And so when they view things, they don't see it as a whole. And so what fascinated me about this view of a Genesis as a historical book was that the coherence of all the pieces suddenly was very, very interesting. That to me was the power, it's kind of the consilience of induction. It's not one thing, but it's many, 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 many things adding together that all of a sudden you're like, wow, that actually explains a lot.
Yeah, one thing I saw, I went to the Creation Museum in Kansas a couple of years ago, and they talked about radioactive dating. And it looks like there's a huge hole in the half-life, the available radioisotopes that would allow us to date various processes more accurately. What do you have to say about radiocarbon dating? Did that play into the movie very much?
Yeah, it did. So we worked with Dr. Andrew Snelling, Andrew Snelling is a Australian geologist. He actually did his PhD work on uranium and was part of an international team. And this is not, Christian. He was a part of the conventional, it was a governmental agency for Australia that worked with the international team on uranium and other areas of radio. He wasn't working with radioisotope dating. He was just working basically with these types of geological substances. The point is he took his knowledge, and he's the one we interviewed for this, and began to apply it. And so he's noticed a series of anomalies that basically are hard to explain if there is a consistent half-life as basically, of uranium or potassium, et cetera, depending on what you're looking at. There are a number of different these. I think uranium, lead, obviously C14, and a number of the deep time stuff. The anomalies are significant, and there are multiple ones. Now, I would say the creationists would be the first to say we don't have a really good explanation of why these anomalies are there. But the anomalies should give us pause to say that we can hang our hat on all of these, of the Earth being that old. And so that's what I would say they presented more of a negative argument as opposed to a positive in that regard, and just saying that I think that this is not probably a reliable dating mechanism. And so I would always encourage people to go look at Andrew Snelling's work. We've got a lot of his videos online where he digs into the specifics because, I'll be honest, the radioisotope stuff, as it started to get into the mathematics and the molecular biology, were two areas that I would always okay, this is probably more than I can totally understand. So I'll quickly move people over into the PhDs and say, go talk to these guys. They got their degree in it.
How did it change your perception doing his Genesis history? When it started, what did you think? And when it ended, how did it change for you? Your thoughts?
I think my awe and my amazement at the world really grew. So I'm a runner, and I used to go run. I still remember that I'd run in the morning with my dog. She's a lab. And I would look at the dog and could kind of see into how all of her body worked. Like you watch her muscles and you watch all the way that, she has all these systems inside. They're just working perfectly. I could throw a ball and she can grab it out of the air. And it's like, so how do you do that? All the muscles, all your eyes, everything works together. We would go and I'd look at a tree, and you look at how the leaves and how the chlorophyll works, and you look at how the structure, the fractal structure of how all of the branching of just a tree, and you see it everywhere. You can look at the atmosphere. So I began to be intellectually overwhelmed with the complexity of the world. And that's what I would say is I began to realize just how little I understood about anything. And so it was probably a very humbling experience where I began to have great awe at the way God had created the world, and really reflecting on just how, as a creator, he did things so incredibly well and so purposeful for our enjoyment, for our health, for everything we need. So anyway, that was probably my takeaway, was just an amazement at the world.
Yeah, I've done literally about 3,500 interviews with different people, and humans can't even recreate an organelle inside one cell. And the amount of complexity is it's stupefying. I remember I interviewed Dennis Noble, who's, he's been in biology for 60 years. He said it was estimated that there are 10 to the 70,000 possible interactions inside of an average person. And it just made me laugh. The number is so absurdly huge. It literally made me crack up laughing.
It is. Complexity. And we live like this every day. I remember when, listening to Dr. Rob Carter talk about the 4-dimensional genome, and it was so overwhelming. I think it's probably very similar to this for people who've gone to the Grand Canyon. You stand at the edge, and it's overwhelming. You cannot take it all in. It's so big. And I think that is, in a sense, what God is. That's the reason why there's a doctrine of general revelation, is that you can look at the world and know something about God. And it says why, you can understand something from the creator by looking at the creation. And I think that's a good way of looking at it. Stupefying is exactly the right word.
So what is the new documentary about that you're working on?
So the new documentary is called Mountains After the Flood. And what it is, it looks at some research Andrew Snelling was doing in the Grand Canyon at these enormous folds. And most people don't realize they're there, but along the eastern side of the Grand Canyon and actually throughout, there's folded rock that is 10, 20 stories 50 stories high, enormous folds. And they are looking at these folds and trying to say, well, when did this happen and what caused it? And so what the new documentary starts there and builds into the world, builds into the area of geomorphology, the shape of the earth. How did we get the earth that we currently have? And how was that a result of the flood? And so we'll end up looking at all sorts of areas that a lot of us take for granted, but from the mountains all the way to the river valleys to just basically what the world currently looks like. And again, a lot of it is the arguments is that catastrophes are a good explanation of how we got what we have. And so the documentary essentially looks at a research project and how creation science works, starting with the Bible, but then getting in and digging into really specific scientific, in this case, geological thin sections and examining the mineralogy of rocks and to say, when did they form? How did they fold? And then using that as an example of how essentially these creation scientists come up with models about the formation of the world that work in accordance with Genesis.
Are you far enough along where you've reached the conclusions on the folded rocks? And, without spoiling it, are you able to share anything?
No. Yeah, there's no spoiling it. Andrew has already been releasing his research. You can see it on the Answers Research Journal. Yeah, their argument is that when you look at these folds under the microscope, you can look at them what's called macroscopically, and it looks very much like these are very smooth folds. But their argument was, a conventional argument was, well, there's got to be probably some metamorphism. There's got to be some level structural change inside the rock that would be different, say, where these rocks are folded. And some of these folds are like 180 degrees, solid rock, versus an area that's unfolded. And so they basically took samples of rock where it's, that's peat sandstone, it's totally flat, unfolded. Then they took samples in the elbow of the fold, the point at which there'd be the most pressure. And they looked at them, under the microscope. Basically, they created a thin section, which is about 30 microns in thickness, and you can look through the rock. And they studied it, and basically the argument was that there's really no difference between any of these samples substantially, and there's no evidence of metamorphism. And so it would stand to reason that these sediments were all down simultaneously, and they were folded at about the same time while they were still ductile or soft. And the ability for them to fold when they're soft is that they then would not have any microscopic evidence of any kind of metamorphism, which is what we see, which would then mean that it lithified or hardened after it had been deposited. And so, yeah, it's a fairly, we go all the way to look at the microscopic slides and look at all this stuff, and it's a pretty cut and dry argument. We show everybody and say, okay, there it is. Anybody can go online and read all of Andrew's arguments and see the pictures for themselves. So
how fast would the folding have occurred based on the data you see?
That's a great question. These guys would have probably said the folding would have occurred over weeks and possibly even months. But the idea is that many of these layers were laid down during the flood and would have still had water entrained in them at various places. They wouldn't have dried out. So what happens is you've got this question of how does God get the water off the continents? So yeah, you've got these layers that have water inside, but then you've got water above them. Well, the way you get water off the continents is you raise the mountains up. And that's really an explanation of what's going on in the western United States. And so we focus particularly on the Colorado Plateau, but these are huge, huge areas. And what's interesting is a lot of these areas, including, the entire western United States, would have lifted up in something called the Laramide orogeny. And so from a conventional viewpoint, this would have been in the Cenozoic, early Cenozoic, maybe, 65 million to, say, 50 million years ago, maybe 40 million. These are loose terms. A creationist would say, no, this is happening at the end of the flood. And because it's happening at the end of the flood, it's happening over a very short, maybe, 1 year, maybe a couple of months time horizon where these things are being pushed up. The challenge that the conventional side has is that there are over 300, well, that's not true. It's more than, 50 million to 550 million. There's like nearly 500 million years of rock layers that have laid up that are then all folded simultaneously. So the problem is that how do you have a hard rock fold enfold all over places. I mean, you can find these all over the world, in this case, particularly the Western United States. How in the world would that have happened? And so they've got to have a mechanism, and metamorphism is the mechanism. But when you look at all this, you begin to see, wow, that's a lot of shape and movement in the Earth's surface that happened to form what we see today.
People that watch the movie, the Genesis history, I guess does it propose a young Earth creationist view, or does it propose somehow? Okay. What kind of feedback did you get from Christians on that?
Well, I mean, creationism, there are only a handful of histories of the Earth, and that was kind of what I often pointed out, that there is obviously a view that the Earth is, 10,000 years ago, that there was a global flood that created a lot of the formations and events that we see on the Earth's surface. Then there's our views of what would be Christians who would hold to the conventional timescale of billions of years. And so you have in those there are only two Christian groups that are two sides of that story. You have progressive creationists who then have to have, well, where did life come from? Well, it's actually 550 million years old, starting at the Cambrian, but God had, 20 to 30 progressive creation events. And he, would create, and there'd be extinction events, and he would create, and there'd be extinction events. And Cuvier starts this. He's a Frenchman, and right now, Reasons to Believe folks hold this. And it's kind of a smaller group. They were not as happy with what we were doing. And then, of course, theistic evolutionists would say, well, actually, God just used evolution, and they would follow the evolutionary timescale in terms of events. And notice what we're looking at here are differences in terms of time and differences within the conventional view of terms of biological sourcing. Where did the creatures come from? Is there a lowest common ancestor, or are they progressively created? And I would argue both those views create a different series of problems with the Bible, but they also create a different series of problems within science. And so they were not, the folks that were theistic evolutionists and what I would call progressive creationists were not as happy with us in terms of our view of things.
Which view do you think is Genesis history support most of all? What would be the age of the Earth, and is it strictly biblical? Yeah,
so Genesis history comes at this saying that the Bible provides both a reasonable sequence of events and also provides a reasonable timeline. Now, I'll be the first to say that there actually are a number of ways of interpreting the scripture, including a couple different traditions, whether you're coming from the Orthodox Church tradition, which holds more to the Septuagint timescale or timeline, to the Protestants who hold more of the Masoretic, and Roman Catholics as well, which is the basis of the Usher dates. But I would say the young Earth view would say that the Earth is, no more than 10,000 years old, and then some people will say, 7,000, 6,000, and so forth. I would probably hold to a little bit of a Septuagint view of things currently. But all that is that everyone's in the same view that this is a recent creation, and certainly stands very much over and against a view that the Earth is billions of years old. So it is a radically different timeline than the majority would hold.
I don't know if you could answer this. Maybe the scientists would be better. But what could happen that would really firmly be able to date, the Earth and the events on it and the creatures on it, et cetera? Would it be a new substance that can do radiocarbon dating with a half-life that's more appropriate, let's say like 1,000 years, or what would move the needle on this, you think?
It's a really good question, because in looking at this, I think that one of the challenges we have as moderns, and when I mean moderns, 19th, 20th, 21st century folks, is our epistemology is assuming that there's some scientific, that science gives us truth that is, can always be known everywhere. And so I think science has been confused first with the creation. People look at the world and say, well, that's science. Well, no, it's not. Science was something that man has created. I mean, to quote Paul Nelson. So the problem is that when you take an empirical view of the world and use that as your basis, then you're constantly looking at things, but you have to put it through a grid of a person. And so that's where I would say that, is there something that you can scientifically prove things? I would always find that probably not, meaning in terms of science being the source of knowledge, because I actually don't think science gives us ever long-term knowledge. That sounds kind of crazy, but I think the creation is ultimately where truth is. And so although science can give us things that are more or less accurate, it has been proven to be demonstrated over and over again to be people that everyone thinks something is true only to find that it's not. And everyone will swear that they know this is the fact only to find later that it's not. And so I find that placing your epistemology on areas of history, we don't usually go to science to tell us about what's happened in the past in many areas. And so I think that there are other areas of knowledge that are equally as important and equally, well, in some cases I would say superiorly. And that the Bible, I would argue, provides a superior epistemological structure for us to work off of. So the idea of finding, a half-life or some, element, or even going and saying, great, we're going to go find, some, the joke is a rabbit in the Cambrian, as one scientist said, but, finding some paleontological evidence. My assumption is that people who don't want to believe it would create some scientific argument for why it couldn't be what it seems to be. And so that's, I think, so if that makes sense, there's a flaw in just wanting to think that we could even find something that actually does do it, because I don't think it's even epistemologically possible.
Well, I know you can't make endless movies, but what other subjects do you think need to be tackled? I know you're only one person, there's only so much time, but in addition to this new one on the Grand Canyon, like what ideally else would you like to do, documentaries on? What subjects?
Well, I mean, I immediately, it's actually kind of funny you asked that. I just talking to some friends about recently about, there really needs to probably be one in kind of a true history of climate change, and saying that if, a lot of what we looked at this time, like we were in the Green River Valley, which is totally arid. It's in southwestern Wyoming, and yet it used to be a lush lake. And this is enormous areas that are currently desert and arid used to be incredibly fertile. And I think that climate change, when you start looking at geology, it's the rule, not the exception. And so a lot of what people today are thinking about, that everything is coming to an end, or, we're having an ice age is coming, or et cetera, all these doom and gloom. When you start looking at this from a biblical perspective, you're like, yeah, there was a heck of a lot more climate change recently than most people even realize. And I don't think that we are going to be able to throw ourselves into that, knowing what it took last time, as in a global flood, to make the climate really do crazy stuff. So that's a film that probably needs to be made. I probably would love to do a film on life after the flood. So there are a lot of things young Earth creationists have not researched, and they have a lot of things that we just don't know. And biogeography, how did animals get from where they are today backwards to the Ark? Who was on the Ark? What wasn't on the Ark? Looking and comparing the paleontology of the Cenozoic. These are all areas that I think really are interesting to me. And so, at some point, perhaps I'll be able to delve into them from a documentary perspective.
Yeah, I've seen documentaries on the Exodus and a few other things on YouTube, and they seem to be really interesting and have very well supported, science. So I don't know if any of your efforts dovetail with those, or, learn anything from those, or if other documentarians have contacted you guys and said, oh, because you did the Genesis history, we're going to do that, and, any collaboration suggested by other people?
Yes. Well, it is interesting. So my friend Tim Mahoney does all the Exodus stuff, and he's fantastic. I love Tim and his work. I have one of the long-term projects that I would like to do that would probably much bigger than the Genesis history, is really doing something on is the Bible true? And so this is a project I've been working on for a number of years, kind of sketching out, and it would be bigger. I mean, we would need to partner with folks like some probably very large Bible foundations that would want to see this. But this is basically a history of how the Bible was written. And I like to say it goes from Mount Sinai, which is the first instance of inscripturation, God writing the 10 words, the 10 commandments on rock, all the way to the modern iPhone, where a lot of people read their Bible today. And so the question is, how do we know that what we're reading on the iPhone really represents what God has said? And I think it's a really neat story that runs back 3,500 years to showing how God has inscripturated his word, and also kept it safe and ensured in very interesting ways that it would be unadulterated. So that's another documentary series. That would be a very large series that when we can have time to focus on it, we will.
Well, very good. So is Genesis History, is it just freely available on YouTube? And this new documentary, where is the old one? Where is the new one going to be? And how can people get access and when?
So so Genesis History is on YouTube. I think it's on Amazon and Freevee. You can get it on Tubi TV. You can get it, obviously, buy it on our site. A lot of people want the DVD or Blu-ray. Our series Beyond is Genesis History, which is basically all the interviews that we did, and we added another 15 hours of material. And then we have a whole conference that was another 70 hours, just lots and lots of material. Our new film will be released on our website, and then potentially we'll get some, we'll look into seeing if we want to do some sort of distribution. It'll likely be on Amazon and in a number of other areas. To be honest, we're just right now trying to get it finished. So it has proved to be a little more difficult to edit. We filmed it over 3 years. We started it during COVID. It's just been a very different process than shooting the first one. So the hope is it'll be finished by March, and then we'll start releasing it. And if you're on our website, if you're on our email list, you can get it on isgenesishistory.com. We'll make sure everyone's updated.
Okay. Oh, last question. Did you experience any censorship from YouTube or any other platforms you put it on, or any attacks, or was it,
No,
did you guys
we haven't. I mean, the most interesting story we had was Wikipedia, and that was a fascinating. Somebody put our film up, and I think you can go in there. You can actually see it if you look at the background. It was a huge multi-year fight between various folks. And I just kind of watched it a lot of times. People would put something and edit it, and it became a real eye-opener to the way Wikipedia works. It's sort of this pyramidal scheme of angels and demons, and there are higher level folks that can always, cancel out lower level ones. And so it was generally the evolutionists kind of won out on Wikipedia to give their view of what was in the film. And so that was the only time I would say it was really interesting to see how some people would say, well, no, this is just a presentation of what's being said. Other people are like, no, I don't want it to say that. And so that was probably it. We have not really received a lot of, people don't like it and complain about it and say, negative things, but that's to be expected, whatever you do. So in general, there's been almost no censorship in that sense. But I think it's fair.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, my view is it's a free market of ideas, and I don't want to censor anything evolutionists are saying. Yeah. I don't want to censor anything that progressive creationists or, theistic evolutionists. Everybody should have the right to say their view and let people in the free market of ideas make their own conclusions, say what is the most reasonable view. And that's all I think is what we should be doing, is having respect.
They said Wikipedia.
Wikipedia does not do that. And I think people are not aware of how Wikipedia actually works. And I know that I'm not the only one that has found frustrations in various ways, depending on who has control of the editing of it. It's just it's an unusual world, as opposed, it's certainly not a free market of ideas in any way.
Yeah. Well, very good, Thomas. It's been a great call. So people should go to YouTube and, bone up on the Genesis History before the new documentary comes out. What do you think your timeline is for the new one? When's it going to come?
I really hope it gets released in March. That's what we're aiming for. It'll be late March, early April is what we expect. And so we're just, scrambling to get everything finished. These things are very complex and always take more time to try to keep things simple. And that's kind of where we are right now, is finishing up animation and just polishing it so that it's clear.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, again, Thomas, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's been a lot of fun.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.